It's good to see you all. So, this morning I went through very quickly, because of the time we get on these platforms, an overview of an arc of work that I've worked on. And there's two reasons we're doing that. Well, first is it's an introduction to how some guest lectures are going to work. We're going to ask people to come in, talk to you about their work, let you go away and look at that work, and then come back on and have like a seminar, like a Q&A with them. I also guess the other element that I'm interested in showing you, apart from those of you who are going to stay on and study with me, the kind of work that I do, the kind of work that I'm interested in, which is very different than like Peter's and Stephen's and Kim's and everyone. We all make very different work. But I think is also just to try to emphasise what can be done in terms of research locally. There's no glamour to Blackburn. It's not the kind of thing that, if you do a degree at Blackburn or you're making a commission and work in Blackburn, that people will say, oh, that's like incredible. It's not got the romance of, say, like London or a bigger city. And I've made work in other places. I still make work in other places. If any of you did extend that research and went onto the website, you'd have seen those other works. But what I'm really, really interested in is this idea of what new works can be made from research on our doorstep. So I'm quite interested in heritage and nostalgia, but from a sort of critical standpoint. And I'm very interested in spaces, what spaces do. So sometimes the exotic is always the thing that's away from you. It always looks exotic to think about other places. I think it's a common mistake that lots of art students think they'll make better work, or lots of artists even, if they're somewhere else. The idea that being in New York will make you work better. But the exotic relies on the idea of being elsewhere. Trust me when I tell you that I know people who are outside of our area, one of whom's in New York, who we've visited, Katie, you've been on one of those trips, who think that all that stuff that I was talking about this morning is equally as exotic. It looks really interesting to the outsider. So that is also interesting. What can we make work about our own cultures and our own communities and our own circumstances? Now, I don't know if anyone has got questions, but I'm happy to give you the opportunity to ask them now if you want to. And if you are going to, and you can turn your camera on, or you don't have to. I prefer it, but if you don't want to, I understand. Okay, any questions?
Oh, I've got one about the biennial exhibition that obviously you were a part of, and I volunteered to help you with that. Once the renovations were complete in your sort of exhibition area, how long did it take you to put the work up?
It took a month to renovate and hang the show, but I didn't actually hang that show. So I made all that work, but I like to work with a curator. So what a curator does is sometimes I'm not very good at, some artists aren't good at presenting their own work because you're so involved in the work. So working with a producer or a curator allows a new voice to come in and work with you on presenting the work to the best it can be. So that hanging that show took quite some time. It took a long period to hang that show. It was my dog won't leave the room.
Oh,
Out.
Don't hit him. It's only a plastic bottle. It's not going to hurt him.
It took a month to hang that show, Katie, to do. And while the space was being done, the process of curation was being discussed, like where will the film go and why should it go there? So one of the things about curation is how do you tell the story of the works? How do you lead an audience around the work? And that was really, so the curation of that show was, and obviously like people, the curator said to me, what should we do this? And you sort of said, oh yeah, no. But one of the things was, what will the first thing that you see when you come into the exhibition? So that's what we always work on. So there's this idea of what we would call like sight lines of sight. When you see through the window, what do you see? When you walk through the door, what do you see? When you turn the corner, what do you see? And how does that signpost an audience visually? And it's an important thing that you'll all have to start thinking about, either in a digital exhibition or a physical exhibition. the success of a show, an exhibition, is crucial on how shows are hung and what how do works function together when you place them next to each other. So you can take really good work and hang it badly, and it drops the impact of that work. And you can take the same work and hang it in a more sophisticated, thoughtful way, and it elevates the work. So the idea in Transform was that there's these huge big glass windows. So what would people see that would make them want to come in? And when they did come in, what would they do? So the first thing you could really see was the red banner, the Live the Dream banner. And then when you're in that space, there was also the warehouse, the mini warehouse, which I wanted people to go into. So you got people doing things straight away. Then when you turned, you could pick up a catalogue. And then you turned into that space. It had the stained glass, the banner, the lights on the wall, and behind you, the little education space. Then a film space, and then an illuminated work at the back, which pulled people through. So the long answer is, it took a month, and thinking about that hang you were involved in that thinking when we were like renovating the space, like where will the walls go? Why will these pillars be grey? And that was to give it a slightly darker area for the film. And to sort of section off the gallery space. So there's a lot goes into it. The most difficult thing to hang was the stained glass, because it needed light to go through it. Without light going through it, it didn't catch. So we had to install some lights, which I thought looked awful. I was really down about the lights because it was difficult to hang the stained glass. We had to drill through the ceiling and hang chains around a steel girder that was running through. So it's always more complex than it looks hanging work. And then those lights were all we could use, and they were visible, and so I hated that part of it. So there's always things that you're not happy with. So about a month and then a day to take down.
Wow.
Any more questions?
Hiya. I was going to ask, to what extent would you say you're a maker rather or an artist? Do you actually, how much of your work do you make?
It's a very good question. It's an excellent question. So, I'm all that work is mine. As an artist, I have authorship for all of that work, and I consider that I made it all. But in the true sense of the word, in terms of being a maker, in that show, what did I actually physically make with my own hand? The screen prints. I made some screen prints. I don't think it's important. It's not important to me anymore. It's really important to some artists. I celebrate making and crafting my work, and the work that I want to make, sometimes I don't have the skill set to realise. So there's the idea, the strategy of collaboration. It's not new. I mean, I'm not claiming it to be new.
Yeah.
If you think about Duchamp's urinal, the idea of the ready-made, there's a relationship to that. But that was that's sort of an off-the-shelf concept. The idea that having stuff made for me is almost like a Renaissance studio strategy in truth, linked to the Industrial Revolution. So, much like a lot of those artists at the time will have had a studio. I have two assistants and a studio producer, and Alex is a studio producer, and it's often really collaborative in the making. But a lot of that work went out to be made. Like it was made, like I said, by factories or by other people. I didn't actually paint banners. I did the original painting for the banners, which was small, but I didn't actually physically paint the banners. Durham banner makers who've been doing it for like 100 years, they actually physically painted and finished the banners. It's not for everyone. It creates a tension sometimes, because some people don't like it. Some people don't like the idea of an artist who isn't involved in like the heroic mark making of their own work and like the struggle of the materials. But all I can sort of say to that is to get to that point. Like I have done that, obviously. I just haven't done it for a while. I think the last physical piece of work that I made was I did some casting about 2 years ago, and I physically cast those pieces. But I also worked with a finisher in London. Dan Edwards done guest lectures up here and done he was a festival making artist. And we went to art school together. We were in the same class, and he runs a finishers and a framers in a gallery in London called Derbyshire's, and they specialise in working with artists. So they'll do the finish of a piece of work, even if that's like a really complex framing solution, or whether it's like a cabinet or something that needs to be specially made. And I work with them a lot on finishing stuff. I don't think they did that much they just like framed normal stuff in Transformed. But I often work with them. So like when I did some Castelled, I sent the work to them and said, how can I best present this? And they do stuff like, they make like Damien Hirst cabinets and things like that.
Yeah, I was about to mention Damien Hirst. Sorry. I was just going to say, I brought it up because I feel like a lot of people who are sort of, I guess, uninitiated to the idea, to like the modern idea of what being an artist is, I hear a lot of people, like having a go at people like Damien Hirst and people like Tracy Emin as well, for, even though she does make a lot of her own work, but more like exhibition pieces like, I don't know, Damien Hirst's like Cow and whatever. Let people have a go saying that he's not an artist, but I guess it's like, it can be defined in different ways. You're still thinking of it.
Yeah, I think that it's often when people first start being involved in the conversations around art, it's a difficult conversation, and that's mainly because of the way that you start to learn to be an artist. It's like through skills acquisition. You learn to use materials. You learn to paint, draw, use ceramics, photography, whatever. And then I suppose that there's an assumption that further later in your career, that because you don't do that all the time, that you can't do that. Jeremy Deller is an artist who often is positioned as a minor player in his own work, because, I think something like We're Here Because We're Here, the World War One piece, he talks about that being like an email. He did an email saying what he'd want to do, and then he worked with a designer to do some really basic visuals, which was like cutouts of archival cutouts of black and white soldiers from First World War, literally dropped into like contemporary town centres, and you get the work straight away, you get the proposition straight away. And then it was like the theatre people who were working with big groups, and that I'm really interested in that kind of work. But what I would definitely say to you all is, it doesn't mean that I don't like the others. So I get on. Me and Peter Lazelle are really good friends. We couldn't be more different in the work that we do, and we speak to each other about our work all the time, and we like each other's work a lot. So Peter is literally like the lone wolf master painter. If any of you have ever seen any of his paintings are just incredible, like just incredible. I don't know how he does it. They're beyond photorealist, these paintings that he does. He paints like a Renaissance painter. And he's very much like on his own, in the studio, battling with oil paint. And, and he talks about like looking all the time. And I don't work like that at all. But someone once said, well, what kind of work do you like? And I was like, I like it all. So that the idea of what an artist is not definitive. But for me, it's not limited to craft. It's not limited to just technique. And craft and technique will only take you so far, for anyone.
Sorry.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, I suppose there's one little thing I guess I could challenge in that sentiment, is the fact that, say with people like Jeremy Dell's work, that I feel like it removes art from being accessible to those. So it's something that involves a lot of funding, and it makes it quite, corporate's not the best word, but it involves, where's he getting the money from, basically. And I guess it kind of gatekeeps it in a way, like artists that use, yeah.
It's a really good question. It's a really good proposition. That kind of work is funded probably in the same way that my work's funded. You just get more money for it, but it'll be funded mainly by Arts Council England, or by Heritage Lottery Fund, or by like local borough money, but mainly Arts Council England. And Arts Council England money is disseminated like across the country, and basically like, artists can apply for it. You can apply for that money to make works, which is what I do, or a commissioner usually, like the British Textile Biennial will take funding from Arts Council England, and then artists will apply for opportunities and make work, and that's like the day-to-day job of most artists, is working like that. Now the flip side is you often don't make things you can sell. So something like We're Here Because isn't something that can be commodified and sold. So it's public money and it's in the public domain and accessible to it, and often outside of a gallery. So there's issues around this funding because in places like Blackburn or in East Lancashire in general, it's classed as an area of low participation in the arts, and that's why funding now comes there in the guise of the biennials, the festivals, and sort of things like street art, stuff in Blackburn, all the stuff you see everywhere, Blackburn Open Walls, all of that stuff is funded in that way. Now that's funded by people's lottery tickets in the same way that lots of sport is funded. And my view on it is that a lot of that kind of money is generated in places like Blackburn, but historically goes to places like London. The ballet is also funded by Arts Council England. I've got no beef with ballet or opera or any of those things at all. But I do have a problem when all the money that is spent, usually from areas like ours, gets channeled there. So I think it does make art accessible, actually. But someone like Pete Lozelle or Tracy Emin isn't publicly funded. Tracy Emin will make her work and then it generates market income. So Peter sells his paintings, and Tracy Emin sells her paintings. Damien Hirst sells his work. They will often be funded either by a gallery or be self-funded. So there are these two sort of competing mechanisms for making art. And for my own personal space in there is probably somewhere in between. Because I do make things I sell, but I also, like lots of art artists, like a lecture as well. So that's always a sign of... So my work's triangulated between lecturing, selling work, and being funded to make work. So the Textile Biennial is all funded. So there's an amount of money you get to do it, and that's the amount you've got. And then you pay people. So you pay all those other people who are fabricating and making work, pay assistants, rent the space off the council. You pay for everything out of which is exactly what Jeremy Della will do, but with a much bigger team to do it. So it's an interesting proposition, but I sometimes wonder if it makes art more accessible because people see it in places where... I mean, we don't have a big contemporary gallery. The nearest would be Manchester in terms of a contemporary space.
Can I just jump in there? Sorry, on that comment, I'm thinking almost like the big stuff like you just mentioned, not the stuff you sell, the other stuff, it's part of an experience. It's experienced by the community, isn't it? And therefore you can't capture that and sell it. It's part of the engagement. So in that sense, it's got a whole other life that a picture on a wall doesn't have.
No, it's really complex because like those banners, I own those banners. I'm really happy to talk to you about all this sort of stuff because it's the real. It's like and sometimes art students talk about the art world, and often what we're talking about is like auction houses, which have got nothing to do with artists or the art world. That's usually like secondary selling. When people are selling Damien Hirst work for millions, he doesn't get any of that unless it's directly from the gallery. So usually the business of being an artist is tied up in this stuff. Did someone say something? So for me, go on, Bridget.
No, just so you still own some of the things you made, but then there was this whole aspect of the community experience that happened.
Yeah, totally. And you have to do that to get the funding.
The funding allowed that to happen, and that was part of creativity in the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've done in that work is I own all of those works. So those works were commissioned and paid for, but I pay myself a lot less out of that money so that I can retain the artwork. So I own the artworks. And then, so like the banners and, well, all of it, like I own it all. And I do sell them. So later, I'll try to sell them. So like I have sold the Live the Dream banner. So like, I do sell work as well. And that's because I'm trying to like navigate those two things. But I've delivered all of the things that the funding was supposed to deliver. And the engagement with communities is part of It's part of the agreement to get funding. So you can't just sort of like, it's very difficult to get funding just to like do some paintings, like really difficult. It's easier to get commissioned by someone to do it, or it's easier if you're going to do something like, think about the kick down the barriers stuff at the museum. There were paintings in there. Well, they were commissioned, those painters were commissioned to make those paintings about something, and they were paid to do it, but they'll own those paintings. And the pay isn't sort of like, it's okay, but it's not. It's like minimum wage stuff, really, in truth, with the amount of work that you do. But you are getting paid to be an artist, and that's like the real coalface sort of job of being an artist, really. So something like the Flashback archive was something that was a condition of funding. It was like, let's see, when you report back on what you're doing, they were like, this is really interesting, we'll give you some more money. Well, actually, it was, we'll give you money towards the Adidas exhibition, which was the big trainer exhibition, if you make this archive. And so Alex and I worked on that together, and that one's a little bit different because I don't really think of it as an artwork. It was really collaborative. But I'm really, really pleased with. For me, it was a new way of working. I'd not done anything digitally before, and during that lockdown, when loads of people were in the first lockdown, when they couldn't go out and see things, and everyone was looking at the internet and digital artworks. By fluke, we just made that and launched it, and it got got a ridiculous amount of people going on it because the people were all furloughed or they were all at home or they weren't at college, and so there was a whole generational thing around the Flashback work. That it got like, I think it had something like 200,000 full engagements, which means someone playing through everything, not just bouncing into the site in the first week, which was the target for like the year, and it did it all in the first week, and it continues to be, because people are at home and it's really nice to go on that site and listen to those stories and look at those. I mean, it just worked. I'm not sure whether it's an artwork or not, but it's a something.
Can I just ask along that, you mentioned like the uncultured creativity came up quite a bit, like on your website, different spots, and that's partly what we're talking about here. And like, so as you've got that on your website, and I thought, I'm not really sure what my question is really, but I just thought, like, it's something I just really, aspire to do, is just like, let's all be creative, and it doesn't have to be known that we're all being creative, but like there's a lot going on through lockdown, and I'm sure there's a lot going on locally, but I was just wondering, like, how can we just encourage people to own it, that I am engaged in creativity, I'm engaged in art, and kind of be proud of it, and this is happening in our area and all those kind of things. And you mentioned on your website, and I was wondering, is there any particular things you're doing to promote that, or is it the whole part of Prism and all the rest of it that's to do with that?
It's a really good question. So uncultured creativity was a proposition. I was saying it a lot. We were having meetings and we were working, and I was saying it a lot as a shorthand to explain what I meant about the things I was interested in. So it's quite complex, but I'll try to keep it simple. When the mills came, when the Industrial Revolution came, we know the story of work in this area. And then we know the story of migration. People come to those mills to work from Ireland, from South Asia, recently very recently from, because of, as a consequence, Eastern Europe. So you get all of those stories are quite visible. But what wasn't visible was these other things that were happening, like these creative outputs, people coming together and kicking a football around and forming the Football League. It sounds small, but it's actually huge. And then writing, all these mill poets and painters, and then 10,000 people going into a space to dance in this really ritualistic way, and against the main culture. And all of this is important because we live in a place that's classed. If you Google it, it's classed as a place that is not engaging in art and culture. And so my challenge was like, well, it depends what you class art and culture as. And the idea that art and culture is handed down to you from institutions, for instance, it's something that's given to us. It's something that I object to, like I contest it. My sort of proposition about art places like Blackburn, and other people have this proposition as well. Jeremy Dello has similar propositions. Mark Leckie has similar propositions. There are lots of artists interested in this. Is that actually this is a place where art and culture is made. It comes from here and goes and travels outwards. And part of the reason, Bridget, to make it visible is to actually give value to it and to people. So if you live in a place where you're constantly told this is a shithole, there is no culture here, this is not a good place, this town is run down, and also tie that into the nostalgia ideas of it was better in the past, which is nonsense. Go and work in a mill at 14. Tell me it's better then. It's a nonsense, and it's just not straightforward as that. But these things become self-fulfilling prophecies. They become, this is a bad place to live. We are unhealthy people. We are not clever people. We're not interested in. We're not good enough for art and culture. We need people to come here from somewhere else and fix us. We need people to come here and tell us things. And actually, historically, it's the opposite. When things like the Football League are formed by mill towns, Blackburn and Darwen, all these places, and some in the Midlands, some in Scotland, all like shipyards, cotton mills, factories, and then it becomes this global culture, whether you're into it or not, this global culture. When you've got poetry in a place where people haven't been to school, and that's what I mean about uncultured creativity, people being creative because they naturally are, because they want to express themselves. I think that for my work, key to understanding it is going back to the camp and hunting scenes lecture at the beginning. The need to describe the world around you and yourself. The need to say you exist and you have value, and that the people that you know and that you love have value, and that the world around you needs to be recorded. If any of you go onto the Mitchell and Kenyon website, on the YouTube, and look at Mitchell and Kenyon, when they were making those films, they had no idea the world was going to change. They didn't film them knowing that we would come along and it would all be different. They filmed them because they were curious and they were creative and they were working with this new form. I mean, how do you make films when no one's ever made films before? They didn't have a Western to look at. They didn't have other films to see. They were making these films. Same as the people painting on the walls of the cave, same as the mill poets. When you've got kids in Milan wearing trainers named after a pub in Blackburn, and you have people in London saying that, there's nothing happening in Blackburn, that for me becomes a reason to make it visible, so that when we're having these discussions now, we have value in our own heritage, but we also have confidence in our own abilities. And also not to become provincial. The reason for Prism is not just to make visible what happens here, but is to bring really great art in from all over, so that you don't end up, I'm not I don't want to make flat cap art. I'm as interested in the art happening in London and New York as I am in Blackburn, and mixing all that up is what I'm really, really interested in. And the idea of uncultured creativity is that you don't need a permission. You don't need someone to come in and tell you that your creativity is allowed, or indeed is any good. It just doesn't, it shouldn't manifest like that. So that's like a long answer to it. Does that make sense though, Bridget?
I suppose I was just trying to think, well, now we've got COVID and everything and lockdown, and have you any ideas at the minute how is that going to change things for you going forward?
No, I'm really struggling. I don't know about you lot, but I'm really struggling through this period of COVID. I'm struggling to be a teacher. I'm struggling to make artwork. I'm struggling to be a human. It's just the worst time. But I do think that things will change back. I think that if you look at history and you look at art and culture, people must have thought this at the end of the First World War, the end of the Second World War, at the end of the Spanish flu, all through history. People think things are never going to be the same again, and more often than not, they are. And maybe when I don't know what the impact will be on art. One thing that is really recognisable is that, because the art world is really commodified and led by objects, the potential of digital media has not really been mainstream explored. And now everybody is doing things like this. And that has become, I think that's going to have some permanence. The idea that, I was going to London for a meeting prior to lockdown. I'd get on the train, I'd go for a 1 or 2 hour meeting, and I'd be gone all day. And that was really normalised. You'd go to that place. I can't see that continuing. I think it'll end up doing this. I don't think that teaching works very well like this. So I don't know how you lot are feeling, but I'm finding it very, very difficult. So some things will change, but fundamentally, I go back to what I said in the work, which is when people gather, they become powerful. That's the communal, that's the cave, that's the tribe, that's the experiential element of when people gather, whether that's in a museum or a concert or in fact in the family home. It's we do gather, and that's where our ideas manifest. So I'm missing going to galleries, really missing it. I'd really love to go and see some shows. I'd really love just to go out because I can't think of any work to do when I'm in the house. The internet can only do so much. But I think.
Yeah.
Go on, Bridget.
Sorry, you're talking because you talked about the transformation. So maybe we don't know yet, but with COVID and everything, what is that transformation going to be? So I suppose we'll see with time. Like you say, digital might be part of it, but yeah, we've kind of gone into that sleep at the minute, I think.
We have, yeah. I think we'll see a lot of bad art. There'll be a lot of bad art comes out of it. It's a bit like there's a lot of bad 60s art. You can spot it straight away. It's like tie-dye art. And there's a lot of bad. So some periods you can look back and go, that was very of its time. But so I'm sure there will be good things that come out of it. But like you said, Bridget, it's probably we're still to see that. Yeah. I'm hoping that digital becomes something more interesting than it's been. That's what I would like to see. I would like digital art to be more interesting than it's been. Because it's my fault. I don't know enough about it, but I'd really like someone to make something digitally that I can look at on my phone or I can experience on my phone or my computer and go, wow, that's as good as. Like happened with photography in the past, like happened with video art, moving image, sound, all these things. It'd be interesting to see if it breaks us out of the gallery permanently. We are down to the last 5 minutes. Go.
I was just going to say really quickly, I find it interesting that you talk about bad art and stuff that looks like of its time, because I've already seen that start to happen. And it's quite funny. There was that guy, I think he's called, I don't know how to say his name, Max Siedentopf, I don't know. He did these unusual masks pictures and he got so much backlash because he's like, well, some people couldn't like afford proper masks, blah, 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 blah. And before this backlash happened, I painted a portrait of one of his images with a girl using a milk bottle as a mask. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And now look at it, I'm like, nah. I just thought it was interesting. I was like, why? It's so, I don't know. It's like, think of something a bit less obvious,
Yeah, I think that what'll happen is you will move through that idea of capturing something just visually. Everyone will be like, oh God, not masks. And I think the art from this period will start to become more about how people feel and the politics of it.
And community.
I'm sure there'll be a work around the 100,000 people died. I mean, that's not over yet, is it? All of these things will manifest in more sophisticated ways. But it'd be interesting to see what art degrees and what. The last thing to make sense of this last bit is before Tracy Emin was Tracy Emin, she got a shop with Sarah Lucas when they were graduates and set up in a shop a bit like, I can see into Bridget's home studio, it looked like that. And they were making small things and selling them cheaply. And people went round and had a drink, and it was I think it's like 1994. And that, they were not art superstars. And their thing was, we can't get into galleries, we're going to get these pop-up spaces, we're going to rent an empty shop in East London and put our own thing on, which is a bit like what we've done in Prism all these years later. And then, she ends up where she is, they end up on that trajectory. So I'm interested to see what that version will be. What will young artists do next? Will they want to work in galleries? Will they want to work in physical spaces? Do you need to be in the same country as people? All of those conversations I think are interesting, but I don't know the answer, and I won't be part of that conversation. But that's what I'm interested to see what happens. I think more people will stay locally again, and not in a crap way, because I think they'll see potential. You can't afford to rent a studio in London anymore; it's impossible. You can't afford to buy a flat in London, but in somewhere like Blackburn, which is so close to all of these other places, you can have a building. And that's why you've seen things like the British Textile Biennial. I would never get the funding to make the shows that I've made. It's interesting that people are interested in them in London, but I'd never get to do it in London. So those things I'm interested in. I'm interested in what Blackburn looks like in 10 years, because what will artists do? Right. It's a good way to end because we're down to 2 minutes. What will artists do? And it's something that you will all be thinking about in your own work. So the final question in less than a minute is carry on considering for your FMPs, not what you can't do, because that's easy, but what can you do during this lockdown with the materials that you've got, with the spaces that you've got, with whatever resources. And we'll be picking that up again shortly. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon.